the Roger Retrospective, where we look at today's headlines through the prism of history. Today with me, a very special guest, old friend, Ray Zucaro, Chief Investment Officer at RVX, and a longtime emerging markets veteran. Spent probably longer than I have, actually, in that fun part of the world. So today we're going to chat a little bit about Venezuela. Been in the news lately, but it's been in the news for a long time. There was a time when Venezuela was so rich that Moody's rated it AAA. This was, I think, the mid to late 70s. How could they possibly go wrong with all that oil? Air France flew the Concorde twice a week. They did have to stop on some island to refuel, but that's a big deal that they had that clientele. And Venezuelan tourists were so famous in Miami and New York for shopping that they got the nickname Dame Dos. Just give me two of them, like for shoes and purses. So let's go back. What went wrong? I mean, you have where we are today. Obviously, the U.S. administration is trying to make some efforts to help out in a pretty unorthodox way, which we can get to later. But you have some experience back in the day in Venezuela, and certainly you have a much better perspective than I do. What sort of signs should we be looking at the time to see where it went wrong?
Well, I like to think of Venezuela sort of like the young sports star that gets $1 million contract and then ends up broke and defaulted and in poverty after his limelight is kind of reminds me of what happened with Venezuela. Venezuela, interestingly, was for I think from 1920 to 1960 the world's largest exporter of oil. Right, this was before Saudi Arabia and Iran really started to take off, in Iraq for that matter. So the country always had a very long history of oil production, right? And then you come along the Yom Kippur War in 1973, 1974, and OPEC raised oil prices 170%, right? So suddenly Venezuela won the lottery. And as a young, uneducated sports star, a young country with poor institutions, the country spent it all, right? In the year after the jump in OPEC prices, the president at the time, Carlos Andres Perez, effectively gifted 10% of the GNP of the country, right? Spending on everything from, I jotted down some of the ones I thought were more interesting. He was actually the first person that set up this Petro-Caribe deal where they basically sold subsidized oil to the Caribbean. But in addition to that, they gave interest-free loans to Guyana. Now, people that are familiar with Venezuelan history, Venezuela claims half of Guyana as their own territory, and they gave them a 40-year interest-free loan. Loans like $50 million to Bolivia at 1% for 40 years. So they basically spent it all, right? And I go back to that, what went wrong? I think the lack of institutions.
Yeah.
And a lot of people blame Chavez, but I make the argument it was really worse under Carlos Andres Perez because he's the one that nationalized the oil industry in the first place, right? He was the one that nationalized a lot of the heavy industry. So he really sowed the seeds of lack of institutional basis, which I think Chavez is really a symptom of it, as opposed to the start of it, if you will.
Now, if you look back, I mean, if you compare data, the GDP per capita, GDP overall between Venezuela and Colombia was pretty similar for a long time. Looking at Colombia today, I think they do have pretty decent institutions. And granted, they had a common enemy in FARC for a long time, so it kept them sort of stable. But did Venezuela never have that technocratic class? They seem to have had the chance to have a large middle class. No, and I understand now it's not going to be the same thing. But like back then, what did it look like? Was the wealth just too overwhelming, and there were no controls?
The wealth came very quick and very fast. So you did, I think many people that the Dame Dos years of Venezuelan abundance, you saw a lot of people get very rich very quickly, but that trickle down effect really was evident even back then. In Brazil, they're called favelas, the poor neighborhoods, right? They had very similar setup in Venezuela, where you had this rich capital with infrastructure being built in metros and highways and such, and yet you had all these shanty towns, building around the city. So to your question about the middle class, look, the middle class, I think for the most part did well, but you
Hmm.
really had the higher echelon of the elites benefiting disproportionately, and that lower portion of the triangle got wider. And when you have such a larger discrepancy between the tops and the bottoms, and when you do start to have real social stresses, and you saw that really come about, really in the 80s in Venezuela after the oil boom had sort of subsided.
As you know, I'm not a socialist by any means, but it's a phenomenon that's has its day in the light again today. Even back in the time, I thought, wouldn't it have made sense for the budget of the Venezuelan government to spend 10% or something? I mean, like driving, I've been to favelas in Brazil and Peru and lots of places. I'm sure you have too. It seems to like, I know it's hard to do on a security level, but like socially taking care of those people, so at least they have the sense that they're not being, neglected. Was that in anybody's thought, or was it the trickle down thing that was very popular and I still kind of believe in? Should have taken care of that.
Well, I can tell you, it has caused me much familial angst.
Mm.
Whereas when I saw Chavez coming to power, Chavez was the first political elite that looked like the mass population of Venezuela,
Right.
that spoke like the mass populace of Venezuela, and and this is the part that's most controversial, addressed some of their needs. Right, the whole Cuban doctors in terms of oil, giving away refrigerators and buying votes, if you will. But he was the first one that actually addressed their needs. So, you know, I have to say that he was the first one that I really saw do it. Right. You had these other, European descent
Yeah.
political elite, doing a power share where you engorged yourself and stuffed your pockets, and then my party comes in and did the same. And I go back to the Carlos Andres Perez years, where he just did it at a, frankly, much worse than any other political leader I've seen before or since, to be honest with you. I mean, 10% of the country's GDP was, basically vanished.
Probably more.
Yeah.
Yeah, that model of the sort of, you see it a lot in Central America, what I call the 30 families that have run the country, for almost 100 years, and they, sort of share power back and forth. I guess there's a balance there, but we're, with Bukele, for example, we moved away from that, right? So in the thing that made it difficult or made it really change and dangerous in Venezuela, was it precipitated by a drop in oil prices and an inability to adjust? Is that what you think it is? And then only all of the other, the constituent assembly and, changing the whole dynamic that came after? Was this an economics problem?
Well, I think it started off as an economics problem because what happened, as I mentioned, Carlos Andres Perez was the one that actually nationalized the oil industry. But in 1959, Venezuela had said, "Look, we're not going to renew any oil concessions," and so most of those rolled off in the 1980s. And what you saw is, as these the owners of the concessions saw the end of their life of their contractual life, they stopped investing. Right, so you actually saw oil production in the boom years. The oil production dropped from 3.4 million barrels in 1973 to 1976, went down to 2.3. All the while oil prices went up 174%.
Right.
Because uh, Carlos Andres Perez accelerated the nationalization. It should have rolled off in 1980. He moved it to 1976. So you saw that they were inefficient in not addressing the slowdown in production that had already started because of lack of investment.
We see that obviously with Pemex, the lack of investment, lack of technical ability. But PDVSA for a while did have a decent reputation, no?
It did. It did. It was often referred to as the state within the state. And I think if you remember, for those that follow Venezuelan history, there was a big oil strike, right? Where you had the state within the state. Hugo Chavez was the democratically elected president, like it or not. He won the popular vote at first, and he was trying to guide the country in a different way, and the oil company resisted and went on strike. And as such, he gutted a lot of the senior management and brought it much more under the state control, right? And then you saw a real drop in, the old adage of, it's always amazing whether, no matter what industry, the people forget the importance of human capital, right? The most important asset of a firm comes in every morning and goes out every afternoon, right? And when you had the firing of this block of experienced oil veterans, even today you see a lot of them went to the Middle East, and frankly, even Colombia has been a beneficiary of the exodus of the talent. So then you really saw it really clamp down. I mean, the Chavez years, whether it be the heavy sanctions of the U.S., especially in 2019, the secondary sanctions really put a lot of pressure on PDVSA. Ultimately, the company and the country did default, but it was a very slow, really, I would say, if you really want to be truly historical, Venezuela really had 6 good years, right? From 1974, and then the problems really started, right? Again, much of the wealth boom was spent. Like, again, going back to that football player that won the contract, and went out and bought 5 cars and a mansion, and then has nothing to show for it. That's really what I think ultimately happened with Venezuela. Look, it absolutely suffered from the Dutch disease, right? I would say it's a much better example even than the Netherlands, where when they had their oil boom, right? Venezuela, you know, unlike a Russia, which does have natural resources, but you have a much better educated population, much larger and much more diverse. Venezuela has a lot of resources. Everyone always associates it with oil and gas, but you have coal, iron, bauxite, aluminum. You have a lot of hydropower, but they really did focus only on the oil industry for the most part and neglected everything else, right? So you didn't really have that diversification, and it's very much the boom and bust cycles of following the oil up and down.
It's funny. Normally, we think in our world think of Chile as a good example of good stewardship, but basically, they still have a state-controlled copper company, far too reliant on it. Probably did not invest as much in education and social capital that they could have, being maybe a little too fiscally responsible. I always look to Singapore when they got their sort of shut off from Malaysia and their own country. They have no natural resources, nothing basically, and they invested big time in the education system and social capital. I wonder though, I worried about this in Colombia 10, 15 years ago when we had 650,000 middle class professionals from Colombia, left, went to the U.S. I think Colombia is doing okay. Do you think that there is enough social capital left in Venezuela to start, on a more organic level, helping turn the country around?
Look, I think when there's opportunities, those will pull talent. Whether again, whether it be the return of ExxonMobil or even the human talent. A lot of Venezuela had one of the largest exoduses of people, I think, in known history, according to the UN. I think the number was almost 8 million, 7.7 million people left, right? And at first you had a lot of the highly educated business owners. I can tell you Miami for sure benefited from that exodus, whether it be, I can tell you, the restaurant scene in Doral or the business acumen I see in Aventura. It was an impressive talent that came to the country. And then, as time went on, you had the more, the Tren de Aragua grouping, and you had a mix. But, at first when the Venezuelans arrived, it was the creme de la creme. And as opportunities do return to Venezuela, and again, I liked your analogy of how they paralleled Colombia. You look at the valuations in Venezuela versus Colombia today, I think that will attract talent. I think you will see a return of human capital, as opportunities do return to the country. And I do think you can see a turnaround, whether it be under Delcy Rodriguez or the U.S.'s administration, a little bit more sound economic policies, a little bit more investments in the different resources. Again, not just oil and gas, but obviously oil and gas is important, especially with all the conflicts in the Middle East. I do think you can see a robust recovery here in Venezuela. And I've been doing this for 30 years in emerging markets. I see the opportunity set in Venezuela as sort of a once in a lifetime, right? I remember the fall of the Soviet Union and the change that took place. I see that opportunity today in Venezuela, right? Because you didn't have a civil war, right? You saw the kind of economic destruction that took place in Venezuela. It reminds you of Lebanon. It reminds you of Syria, countries that were actually at war, right? And that never there was never a civil war scenario. So you never had blown up fields. Like remember when Kuwait, when Iraq pulled back and they blew up all the wells. You never had that type of destruction, and yet economically, it was worse than a worse trough than these countries experienced. So, I am quite optimistic in Venezuela. And again, yeah, people accuse me of being a capitalist pig or whatever not, but I just look at the country's resources and most importantly the human talent. You had some of the smartest oil engineers, some of the smartest mining people in Venezuela, and again, I see it. I can tell you in the architecture of Miami, they're some of the best I've seen around. Right. So some of that talent will return. I'm sure. Will 100% go back? No, not a chance. But if 10, 15, 20% go back, I think you could really see a return of a better Venezuela. Look, I don't think you'll see the boom time of the 70s because I don't think you don't have the oil production. There's a lot of other reasons, but I do think you can certainly have a much better trajectory that will make society and life in Venezuela much better for everyone.
I'll fully admit to being guilty of playing the international analyst who travels into a country for 3 days and thinks he gets a sense of what's going on. But I did do this during the Asia financial crisis in 97, 98. Spent a lot of time in Singapore, Thailand, and Indonesia, and Seoul, South Korea, actually. And it's really funny that, there's usually, as you know, there's usually one hotel that all the bankers stay at, the Grand Hyatt in Seoul, for example. And you could tell just by the traffic in the lobby that, and they're there usually a bit before it's a big story. So I'm guessing, and I've read stories about that sort of activity being very very high right now in Caracas. Have you been lately? I'm thinking of organizing a trip myself, but seems pretty.
I have not been. I've actually just started the process to get my visa because currently you still need as an American a visa to get there. The business hotel that many people stay at is called the Tamanaco in Caracas, where I have stayed in the past. And I do know of trips that have taken place, and I can tell you some of my colleagues have also been renewing passports and looking into returning to the country. Again, we're looking at opportunities of again helping the people return to a more normalized lifestyle.
Do you think geography plays a part here in helping Venezuela, that it's basically a short flight from Miami, and that which is, a sort of a Latin American financial capital anyway?
Oh, absolutely. You look at the infrastructure, the refineries that were built along the U.S. Gulf Coast were much originally designed to process that Venezuelan crude. As I mentioned earlier, the largest exporter of crude in the world for 40 years was Venezuela, and it was mostly destined to the U.S. Right. So geography is destiny. There's no way about it. Right. You're, again, for whatever product, and more importantly, it was vice versa. Venezuela was an important product destination for U.S. products, right? You saw, Ford F-150s and, even Toyota assembly plants there. It was a great destination for the consumer products, right? So it was a symbiotic relationship for sure. You can argue if it was skewed one way or the other, but there was certainly a lot of commerce going back and forth. And, it is no matter, again, whether they like it or not, they're very much in the U.S.'s geographical footprint. And, Trump has been not shy about saying, this is our hemisphere, a renewed Monroe doctrine. I like to call it his Trumpire, the Trump empire.
Mm-hmm.
And, Venezuela, given the resources, given the proximity, very much falls under the yoke of the U.S.
It's funny. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine in Europe talking about that very concept, that you're looking at the world, and we can go on and on, which we won't, about Trump. But it's clear that exactly what you're saying, that Latin America should be a beneficiary of most of his policies, even if chaotic and difficult to follow at times. But it is true that the Monroe Doctrine, it's, I don't want to say it's worked, but people have been aware of it for a long time. So him bringing it up again was not a surprise. So back to Chavez. That he nationalized a lot of industry, but he seemed to have done it in what I would have thought at the time was a pretty fair way. The owners were paid. What is the roadmap mean, I imagine maybe you there's a 73-year-old Venezuelan man who is the last person to leave Caracas, sent his family to Miami 25 years ago. Finally, he's in Miami. He wants his company back, and it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be an aluminum company. It's just a manufacturing company. How does he get that back, even if he has to pay for it? I mean, are we still only stuck on the oil investments, or is there there's a human nature of energy that wants to just make things happen, right?
Yeah. I don't know. Don't take this the wrong way, Roger. I don't know if I agree with that Chavez paid people. I can tell you firsthand, especially like in the healthcare industry where we're very much focused on, there was taking over of properties, and there has not been compensation for that.
Okay.
So, and frankly, even why is ExxonMobil? Why haven't they rushed in? They still haven't been paid for their Cerro Negro investments, right? Their heavy oil investments. So yeah, I don't know if he was as great on the paying. He was great on the nationalization, right?
Mhm.
When you're on TV and nationalize this, nationalize that. You walk down the street and he was taking over buildings and such, which I would say, Carlos Andres Perez, for the most part, let the private sector. They focused on the oil and gas and some of the heavy industries, but like the local businesses, they didn't really get involved in. Whereas Chavez, his price controls, his profit per controls, the whole Khedive where they selected which companies were given access to preferential dollars, where people were able to import goods and undercut local production, right? So you really saw not an encroachment. I don't know how to explain it. Even a larger grab of economic that Venezuela took under Chavez. So he really accelerated it. So how do you get your assets back? I can tell you again, in the healthcare industry where we've been working on it, we don't know yet. We don't know yet. We've had conversations, and I can also tell you, not to get into too details, but there's also accounts receivables. So I don't have a great answer for you yet.
Do you so if looking over the past few months, there was sort of an optimistic energy that we can come to sort of a debt restructuring deal relatively soon and ignore the way that it's been done in the past. Like, don't bring in the IMF, the World Bank. They're doing a debt sustainability analysis, which is sort of like I equate it to a traffic study if you're trying to finance a toll road, right?
Mhm.
You hire a firm, it's going to give you the amount of traffic projections that you need in order to finance the toll road to be built, right?
Yeah.
And I imagine that's what's going to happen here. And of course, there's more debt than we thought existed before. But how much of a wrench do you think the earthquake did in this? That sort of took the attention from this very bizarre way that the U.S. government, especially the Treasury Department, is working with Delcy in managing the money. Are we kind of, is Washington D.C. kind of ignoring it for now and like throw a little money at it to work, because it seemed a pretty devastating thing.
No, the earthquake was absolutely devastating. Look, again, I'm not an expert at this, but when you look at the number of people missing, I think you're going to see death tolls of close to 40 to 50,000 people. I will say, again, please don't take this the wrong way. It happened much along the coast, in an area called La Guaira, near the country's main airport, in some parts of Caracas. It did not impact the heavy oil, the oil industries, the oil fields, the heavy industries, and the export. So I do not think that the earthquake will be a hindrance to oil production coming back online, just because it happened in a different part of the country. And I do think it has taken up some of the attention. And the debt sustainability report and the stock of the debt, there was quite a little bit of news. I guess probably at this point it was like 2 or 3 months ago about what is the actual stock of debt, because there was some Chinese debt that was taken on. So look, I look at Venezuela with the robustness, and I published a monthly piece a couple months back, and you can find it on Twitter. If you look at Ray Zucaro, I publish this all for public consumption. You look at the stock of Venezuelan oil reserves, iron ore reserves, cobalt reserves. They have so much in natural resources that even if the debt stock is 40% higher than many had thought, I still think there's natural resources there, and people will automatically say, well, yeah, it's heavy resources, heavy oil, and it's not recoverable. I even discounted that So I did the whole analysis. So no matter how you slice it, Venezuela was given so much in natural resources that I think that once you get a more of a normalized run rate, that's why I was a little bit in the debtor world. I didn't want to push to restructure debt that quickly because you're not at a normalized production rate, right?
Mhm.
Give them time to get production back up, whether the Western companies come back or not. you know, the ExxonMobil was kind of hemming and hawing. They wanted some kind of sweetheart deal or to be repaid for their heavy oil assets, which are nationalized. But at the end of the day, these companies operate in some of the harshest climates, whether it be geographically, politically, war-torn countries. So there's a price where they'll come back, and I think you can get Venezuelan oil production up over the next 1-2 years. We'll go back to the 4 million at the boom years. Hard to see in the short term, but I think we're currently running about 1.1, 1.2 million barrels. I could see that getting closer to 2 million over the next 12 months with that capital, and that gives you a much more sustainable run rate. So a very long-winded answer to your question, Roger, but look, I'm still optimistic on the Venezuelan outlook here, just because the country has really so much in natural resources. People, sorry, one more thing. People again like to harp on Venezuela has the largest oil reserves. Yeah, but they're all heavy. But what I focused on is the more traditional, the long producing assets, the traditional fields. There's still quite a lot of robustness there. You know, I met with an oil and gas company that operates today in Colombia, and they're saying, absolutely, we're looking at the fields in Venezuela because they haven't been doing the horizontal drilling, the other techniques that have gained popularity and helped the shale boom in the U.S. There's a lot of low hanging fruit still available in the traditional fields, not to get into the heavy oil fields of Venezuela.
Right. Now, one thing I always look in these instances is the street, right? La calle. So it's been quiet. And we have two different streets I'm talking about. One street is the local street and I don't know whether there's a nationalism that's being like sort of calm right now because there's not agitation from the top. And then the street that's the diaspora, the Venezuelans elite, that, when we look at Machado, the leaders we've been looking to for the future democratic leaders of the country, how are they dealing in their minds with the fact that Delcy is still in power and a lot of people that we really don't like are still in power? Yeah, there's a realpolitik that I think Kissinger would probably be proud of right now, that the Trump administration is handling this. But how much of a runway do we have before we do start getting pushback?
I think that, again, this is my opinion. Please don't get upset with me, but I think Delcy Rodriguez has an interesting opportunity because it was so bad, and she can blame a lot of that to the prior administration. And now that she's working with the U.S. and you do start to see some trickle down. You do start to see some improvements. Direct flights to Miami, right? More access to hard currency, better imports, better realized prices on oil sales, more production, so higher. So she could actually be in a very interesting spot that she could really enjoy and be seen as having the Chavez roots. Her family has a very long leftist history in the country, and her father has a very interesting story if you want to do some side research on your own. So she has the bona fides of the leftist base. But if she's also seen as overseeing that what could be a recovery in Venezuela, I think she could be a political force going forward, right? Whereas my concern with Machado is she has very much of that vindictive, I want to go after you, and I think that's more problematic here and now. Again, I can tell you that's an opinion that does not go over well at the family dinner.
Mm-hmm.
But I have not agreed with her stance on many things. And look, I don't want the conflicts of the streets and the violence. And Venezuela does have a history of very violent confrontations. The famous Caracaso, who also was under Carlos Andres Perez, when they tried to raise fuel prices, you had violence in the streets and looting, and many people were killed. So I don't want to see a return to that. So I'm okay with the status quo for now. Your question was how long? Look, if in a year from now we can get production higher and there's no violence and they're recovering from the earthquake, I think Venezuela could be in a better position. I think that earthquake was such a traumatic experience for the country. If they see aid coming in, you know, I think they're more worried about getting back to some type of normal life than they are about having elections right away. Again, that's my opinion. Right or wrong, those are my views. So.
The world has changed a lot from in the idealistic days of the post Cold War. So I see that entirely. So I actually tend to agree with you on the timing. I think that probably nothing much changes over the next few months. Slow progress is always good. I look at the monthly, I see the monthly, but I guess you get them more frequently. Production numbers certainly not declining. We've seen large opportunities like Pemex, for example. Pemex versus Petrobras over 30 years. It's hilarious to see the growth and decline in production. So, I'm a bigger believer now in stable and slow growth than I was for looking, years ago when I'd like to see the large, massive finds. You and I both lived through Ike Batista trying to have massive finds in Brazil with $15 billion dollars raised, and that didn't get anywhere. So I think, yeah. So, over the next year, if things sort of stay as they are, can we consider things on the right path? And are there two or three things that, as we come to a close here tonight, that you think that we should be keeping at the top of our mind to look for?
Well, I think also it's an interesting time in a crossroads in Venezuela. What path do they want to pursue? Do they want to have like a Pemex full government control, or something like an Argentina with a YPF? You have a national champion, or I think the Argentine, or really it's also the Russian model, where you have a state champion like a Rosneft in Russia or YPF, but you also have the private sector coming in, getting involved, and potentially down the road a public offering in PDVSA, something again, a public private like a Petrobras or a YPF could be the path forward, right? I don't think we're anywhere near that. I think that could be 5 years off, but I think the opportunity set in Venezuela is quite interesting here and now. If you really looked at my back of the envelope analysis of what is debt sustainability, I can paint a scenario where all the debt should be paid back at par, right? Just given the country's natural resources. Do I expect that? No, but, some type of discount, some type of oil warrants. But Venezuela has a very robust history of trying to pay their debts, right? I think that the default under sanctions and the secondary sanctions really effectively broke the back of the camel. So in the short term, what am I looking for? I'd like to see some type of return of some of some of the big super majors. I'd like to see more capex. I'd like to see better production numbers. I don't want to see. I personally don't want to see a debt restructuring in the next in the very, very short time, because I don't think it's beneficial to creditors. And I think if we can have a little bit more stability, I think we'll ultimately the country will benefit from getting a higher production number, and I think creditors at this point will get a higher recovery value. So I don't want to rush to it. I know a lot of hedge funds got in. The other interesting thing I always like to say about trading in emerging markets, you had a point where PDVSA traded at 1 cent on the dollar because of sanctions, right? As the U.S. put sanctions, a lot of investors were no longer able to buy, and some chose to exit. So you had dollar claims trading at 1 penny on the dollar, right? And some of those claims today are 30, 40 cents on the dollar. So the dislocation of sanctions, I just, creates such abnormalities, and I think ultimately hurts investors more than it hurts the country, right? So, I know it's a long-winded answer again, Roger. Sorry, I tend to go off here, but what am I looking for in the short term? I'd like to see stability. I don't need to see any type of political resolution in the short term, and I'd like to see higher production numbers. And I am curious, what is the actual stock of debt that they report that's supposed to come out in the next, I think it's in the next couple of months.
Great. Well, you obviously have an enormous amount of knowledge and perspective, which is very much appreciated. I follow you on social media, and I'm sure other people should too. Thanks for your time, Ray. Hope to have you back again sometime. This has been a really great discussion. I think very valuable.
Thank you, sir.
All right, great. Have a good night.
Bye bye.